Welcome to TBL Scope. I am Ryan Phillips here with Stephen Douglas, and we are going to talk about the last two episodes of The Last Dance, which finished last night. We'll also talk about the series as a whole, but I want to discuss those last two episodes with you, Stephen. Really an interesting way to finish the documentary, finishing on that 98 championship, but also showing a lot of the 97 championship as well, and sort of how that wrapped up his run with the Bulls. What did you think of the last two episodes of the documentary?
Just like the rest, it was very good, very interesting. It was a fun watch. Overall, I think it was like a really good bad movie. Kind of like the Fast and the Furious. And it's not perfect, but it's fun the entire time. You enjoy it. And the last two episodes, it was good to see they kind of rushed through the 98 championship and the playoffs, and also just that's kind of what they had to do, because they were jumping back and forth, and that's where they ended up. And it seemed like, I mean, there was definitely enough material to keep going, but they obviously decided to land on 10 episodes, and they're like, oh well, I guess we better wrap this up.
Yeah, I felt like it could have been 15, honestly, because there was so much depth in not only Jordan's career, but with that Bulls team and you got to remember, we only got like a half an episode about Dennis Rodman, and that could have been its own documentary, that guy's life. So it was interesting. I mean, Scottie Pippen could have had his own documentary given his beginnings and where he went to, and then where his career went after the Bulls. I also thought it was interesting that they ended. I know this was supposed to be about the 98 Bulls, but they ended without discussing Jordan retiring and then returning to the NBA, which I think is a huge part of his story, because in some ways it takes some shine off him. I think in some ways it proves that, hey, even 3 years later, you could still play, and without playing that long. I thought it was interesting they cut that out. Would you have wanted to see more of that?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of makes it feel incomplete a little bit, because I mean, they spent so much time going back into, especially in Jordan's life, and then in everybody else's. It's like they had all this information available to them of the 20 years since, like where Jordan ended up. I mean, all you really saw from Jordan past 98 was him in three houses that weren't his.
Yeah.
So
For the interviews, right?
yeah, for the interviews. And it's like it didn't touch on anything with the Wizards, becoming an owner, none of that stuff. And yeah, it definitely his legacy went on, and it's still going right now with all the Jordan brand and his work with the Hornets. It never ends.
Yeah, and I get that the documentary is supposed to be about the 98 Bulls, but when you make it about more than that by going back, like if this has just been a 10-part documentary about that season, and it's just solely about that season, but you're telling life stories of people, and to leave out the last 20 years of Michael Jordan is really an interesting choice. And I get you're limited by time. You say it's going to be 10 episodes. You've got to be limited by that. But I did think that was interesting, because I think the last 20 years have in some ways cemented Jordan's legacy, in other ways maybe tarnished it. The fact that, you're right, Jordan Brand has exploded as its own brand, a subset of Nike. He's not just a Nike guy anymore. He's got his own thing going, and it's made him fabulously more wealthy than he ever was before, even though he was doing pretty well before. But that's fascinating, because that's the first time we've seen that out of an athlete, to have this whole extra thing where you're essentially running a shoe company. I think that would have been interesting. I think touching on going to the Wizards, then going to Charlotte, and these different things, the ventures he's taken on in the future. I think that would have been really an interesting take. Maybe that's a bonus episode they need to do, is just sort of rounding out where he is and what his life is. And I think you're right. When you go back and you tell the story going back, you need to tell it going forward as well. I think we need to talk about the flu game, because there were some revelations there that were fascinating, that we all knew about the flu game. It was a big deal. If you lived through that, it was, where were you when this happened moment. And to hear that Michael Jordan couldn't get food at his hotel, we knew that. He ordered takeout. We had never definitively known that it was food poisoning that he had, but some people had speculated that. He orders a pizza. apparently somehow people knew this pizza was for Michael Jordan because and his trainer mentioned that, said, yeah, people knew it was for Michael Jordan. First of all, why don't you use a pseudonym? I don't know, or have the trainer order it. But then 5 guys show up at the door with this pizza. His friends all say this is suspicious, you shouldn't eat it, and then he eats the entire thing by himself and gets sick. That whole revelation was crazy to me, just the way this worked out. Like, you'd think, okay, let's not take this risk in the middle of the 1997 NBA Finals, but he did, and obviously it worked out poorly. What did you think about that scene and the way they played it out and the way they depicted it?
It was simply outrageous. The way it was told, the seriousness. Like, these 5 guys show up at the hotel door, and we think something's wrong with that. And Michael's like, I was the only one that ate the pizza. It's like, okay, this is ridiculous.
Like,
and how has this never been mentioned in 20 years? And then after the episode aired, he went on with Jalen and Jacoby, the director, and said that Jordan had spit on the pizza, and that's why nobody ate it.
I mean,
and he spit on it because they had not waited for him to order dinner earlier in the day. So he got the pizza and spit on it, and that's why he was the only one to eat the pizza. But I mean, just
how did they leave that out of the documentary, by the way? I mean,
right?
that makes it 10 times more interesting. It's like he spits on the pizza to only claim it for himself, and it makes him sick. Like, he got what he deserved there, it seems like.
Yeah, how does that not make the documentary? That seems like a very pertinent piece of information, especially, and he has a history of doing this, apparently, of spitting on food. It's just, it goes to Michael Jordan's absolute insanity. I mean, what does this have? This goes past a competition problem. This has nothing to do with competition.
No, it's psychopathic behavior. Yeah. It's okay to say it. That is crazy. I mean, I think everybody knew that kid in like elementary school who would, I knew a kid who would do that occasionally in elementary school, or like lick a cupcake and put it down and be like, you can have that if you want, but if everybody got a cupcake, they'd lick somebody else's. And, I mean, but that's the kind of thing you grow out of when you're like 6, and Jordan, who's the most famous man on the planet at the time, is doing that in his 30s. That is just craziness. And then it seems like he got what he deserved, by getting horribly sick from it. And I thought what was interesting was hearing the other players discussing what Jordan was like that night. And, some people have said in the years past, maybe he was putting it on a little. He wasn't as sick as he thought. And then they were talking to the players and they're like, no, he was like white. He like looked just like he had no expression in his eyes, just a blank expression. Pippen was saying he had to like carry him to the sideline. Kerr was saying things like, I mean, they were making it sound like it was much worse than we even thought it was, which I thought was interesting, because there have been times where Michael Jordan was always aware a camera was on him, and if he's struggling with something, he might put a little extra on it. We've seen LeBron do things like that. I'm sure Kobe did stuff like that. There's a camera on you and you're struggling. You kind of play up the struggle. They apparently thought there was absolutely he was as sick as he was thinking. I thought that part was really interesting too. It was not just hearing from Jordan and about the food, but hearing from his teammates who were there during it and how crazy it was to them even too.
Yeah, I don't remember Michael Jordan being accused of being theatric in the way that LeBron is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember him like exaggerating a limp or anything, or taking forever to get up off the floor. So I find it funny that people, at least from my memory of Jordan, I find it funny that people would think that he was, exaggerating, like being sick. Yeah. I mean, he was sick. And also it still doesn't really, the fact that it took 20 years for the pizza thing to come out still sounds really funny compared to like it being a hangover game or being a flu game. I mean, why wouldn't you just say, oh, it was food poisoning?
Yeah.
And instead of just calling it the flu. Nobody did the pizza math.
No, and I posted on the Big Lead. I posted the Stuart Scott's call of that Sports Center segment from that game, and he says, hey, and he even mentions, hey, the hotel didn't have room service. Maybe it was bad takeout. We don't know. Like people were even suggesting that back then, but to never get confirmation on it is insane. And I think it goes to just Michael Jordan. Everything about him was secretive. He tried to, he had that tight group of friends that he even talked about in his last couple episodes about how he had this tight circle around him of the security guards and his trainer and stuff like that. And it's, nothing got out of that circle, and it's not the internet age back then when everything leaks out, everything gets told, everybody is talking, and we find everything out about these players and stuff. So you're right. It's insane that it's taken this long, but I think that speaks to just who he was and what the circle around him was like. It's like, you didn't go against what Mike said. If he said nobody talk about this, nobody talked about it, because as we've seen, and this kind of dovetails to our next topic, as we've seen, he held grudges against people and still holds grudges against people years later. I think that the last thing I wanted to discuss about the documentary that we kind of knew, but maybe not to the extent we know it now, is his ability to find motivation in things that may not have even existed. Like, find slights to anger him. And I think the most we talked about before we went on, and probably the most egregious one, is the LeBradford Smith incident, where as a rookie, Smith was playing, or I guess he was he was a young guy. He wasn't a rookie. LeBradford Smith, a nice player, former first-round pick, scored 37 against the Chicago Bulls in 1993, and just shot the lights out. And after the game, the story was told that he had walked off the floor past Jordan and said, "Hey, nice game, Mike." And the next night they played in Washington, and Jordan lit him up for 36 points in the first half, and just was, just abusing the kid the whole game and making him look bad. And it turns out that the nice game, Mike thing never happened. Jordan made it up in his mind to motivate himself. And then last night you saw in 1997, what was the motivation for wanting to beat the Jazz? And he said, well, Karl Malone won the MVP in 97. It's like, Karl Malone had a good season in 97 and he never won an MVP. So, maybe you give him the MVP and sort of a typical thing that happens in the NBA. And Jordan, that was his motivation for wanting to destroy the Utah Jazz. And those existed throughout. The Isaiah Thomas thing, all of that stuff existed throughout. And in some ways, Jordan still holds a lot of those grudges, whether they're real or imagined. He still believes them and still holds them. What did you think about that? I mean, do you think that's an unhealthy way to sort of live your life, or was that what Jordan needed to be who he was?
I think it's definitely unhealthy, but it's also weird that you get to the NBA championship and you're like, well, I want to win, but Karl Malone won MVP, so that's why I'm motivated. This guy, his entire thing is, winning, being competitive, and he shouldn't. I wouldn't think that you would need more than that, but that's what makes great athletes, I guess. Just whatever gives them that edge. Yeah.
And I just thought it was fascinating to see him, especially, nowadays, talking about Isaiah Thomas. And it's like, dude, it's been so long. You can't bury that beef. And they clearly do not. I mean, Isaiah's going on all these talk shows acting like, I don't have a problem with Jordan, but clearly there's something there for both of them. And I just feel like it's interesting that all these years later, they can't bury the hatchet, and another thing I thought was interesting was clearly the respect that Jordan had for Malone and Stockton. They'd played together on the 92 Olympic team. So they've been on the dream team together. And you could see Jordan, when he'd walk out of the press conference, he'd walk over to Malone and Stockton, win or lose. He'd walk over, shake their hands, and then Malone came on the Bulls bus after they won the championship and congratulated them and stuff. It was interesting to see, just given how much animosity there was against other players at the time from a lot of guys, not just Jordan. I mean, back then it was a knockdown, drag out, beat you up league. And to see those guys all kind of, appreciating each other. Jordan, the other one was Jordan against when Larry Bird was coaching the Pacers. They saw each other after what was a very heated series and a very heated game. And they welcomed each other with some expletives, but they hugged and kind of, moves along. I thought it was interesting that he's very selective in who he's willing to be buddies with after the game's over and who he was willing to pick on.
Yeah, that might be the highlight of the entire documentary when him and Bird talk behind the scenes there.
Yes.
As that was Bird that said it, right?
Yes, I believe it was
Really
Bird that
bad
said it.
words.
Some very bad words, yes.
Yeah,
For a friend, especially.
yeah.
Yes.
But I mean, that's what you can say to a friend. But yeah,
In some cases, yes.
it makes you wonder, like, if maybe Michael and Isaiah had been on a Team USA together earlier in their career, or I don't know, some other circumstance. Maybe if they'd gone to AAU, played AAU together or something, that that never would have happened.
Yeah.
But and then maybe the Pistons aren't so mean to Michael Jordan, and maybe Michael Jordan doesn't become Michael Jordan.
Well, what's funny is that Jordan forgave Rodman. Clearly, he was on those
Yeah,
Pistons. I mean, so it's very selective. And I know you're getting Rodman. You know he can help you win, so you're willing to forgive some things. But then when they played on the team together, they liked each other. I mean, Rodman was spacey, but they got along, and Jordan supported him. So it's almost like, well, if you just change your perspective a little, everything's kind of it's different. And so that's what I found interesting. I also found just the documentary as a whole, I thought was really well made. Obviously, again, there's a lot in it that they kind of let things slide because they had to work with Jordan on it, and so they're not going to be hypercritical of him. And I think that there's some people are calling a little bit of it propaganda, and I think that's fair. But still, I thought it was a fun look back at a piece of history. This one, as opposed to something like OJ Made in America, which was a really hard look at a subject, I felt this was more just a fun look back, and it explored some serious themes, certainly. Um, and we saw that last night with the Steve Kerr, the story about his dad, which I think everyone in our business knows that story, but it was interesting to hear it told by Steve Kerr and his mother, both discussing, his father's assassination. So it did take hard looks at things. I just felt like it's a Jordan documentary. The one thing they didn't take a serious hard look at was Michael Jordan. And so I think that's where it loses a little bit of its shine. But as a whole, given the time we're in right now, this is something we needed. I thought it was really well made. I thought that even just the ancillary stuff like the soundtrack, the music was amazing. All the footage they were able to get, all the interviews they were able to get. I thought it was really well made. Great documentary. That of course loses a little shine when you examine it more closely. But I certainly appreciated it. I liked it. I think it's something we'll remember for a long time too, because we all kind of collectively watched it at the same time.
yeah, yeah. It was definitely something that we all saw at a certain time in history, and it's from a very important time for for basketball in general. I think it'll be interesting. This entire documentary. I don't know if it needs a documentary about it, but like an oral history of how long this has been floating around and the different people, and then once they actually got the go ahead to do it, maybe getting to sit down for the interviews. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff out there about it.
Yeah, there really is. And I agree. I think an oral history on it would be great. A documentary about the documentary would be interesting, or just, an addendum epilogue about maybe from the director about what they wanted, what they didn't get, what they loved, all that stuff would be really interesting. I thought it was great. I hope you guys all watched it. If not, go check it out. Finish it up. It was worth watching. And I think that we all said, many observers said that Game of Thrones would be the last thing we all watched together live, and everything else would be streaming and all that. I think this sort of, because of the circumstances we're in, this sort of became what might be the last thing we all watched live together. Last series we all watched live together. So kind of an interesting moment in history, as well as a great sports documentary. So thank you guys for checking this out. Check out all the latest stories at the Big Lead. We are still pumping out a ton of content. We'll be back with another one of these videos probably next week. If not, we might do one earlier. We'll see. But thanks for tuning in, and we will see you guys soon.